Welcome back, everyone, to How to Read the Bible. Yesterday, we went through an introduction to the first principles of exegesis. We learned about various Hebrew literary devices and styles and tools for how to identify and approach them. In today's class, we are going to be exploring Hebrew narrative. This is a genre and a world unto itself. And although we touched on it in our last class, today we'll go deeper into the world of the Hebrew narrative style, its purpose, and how it differs from Western narrative. But before we get into all of that, we had some homework from last time. You were all invited to test out the new tools we learned and try to exegete the text in Daniel chapter 3. Hopefully that was an interesting activity and you can come away with some notes and observations. We'll go through it now together and see if you ended up noticing some of these points about the text when you went through it. So, hopefully, if we followed the first steps of exegesis as we went through Daniel 3, we will have read through the text as though for the first time, then made a second pass and a third and more if we'd liked. We would have taken notes of what stands out, any preliminary observations, and then we would have read the immediate textual context surrounding verses, paragraphs, chapter, before and after chapter 3. And then, if we felt it relevant, gone to a wider textual context surrounding chapters and identifying key elements about the book of Daniel itself. The first thing I'd like to identify about Daniel is something you hopefully noticed in this text yourself. This has to do with artificial divisions in the text, something we mentioned yesterday. Because although our English Bibles will impose their chapter and subtitle divisions on chapter 3, where does the story of chapter 3 actually begin? And where does it end? Chapter 3 doesn't end at verse 30. The story actually includes Daniel 4, 1 to 4. So the story ends in chapter 4 in verse 4. And when we apply this, it changes the story's perspective. In fact, in the Aramaic texts, Daniel 4, 1 to 3 is numbered as chapter 3, verse 31 to 33. Nebuchadnezzar's public letter to his kingdoms is considered the conclusion to the story in Daniel 3. Then we ask, how does the chapter relate to the larger context, the surrounding chapters? Well, if we read chapter 2, something might ring a bell for us. Because there's a great big statue in chapter 3, but there's also a great big statue in chapter 2. So we ask, what is the connection, if any, between Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a statue in chapter 2 and his building of a statue in chapter 3? What are the similarities between his dream and the statue he actually builds? What are the differences? Well, in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of a statue. Different parts of the statue are made of different materials, and each part represents an empire. Daniel informs the king that the head of the statue, which is gold, represents Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, the Babylonian Empire. But of course, the dream continues to say that though you, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head made of gold, your empire will be taken over by others. Daniel says in verse 39, after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the whole earth. So a second kingdom, represented by the chest of silver, will arrive after Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, followed by belly and thigh of bronze, legs of iron, and so on. And with this in mind, what do we make of Nebuchadnezzar's next move described in Daniel 3? Because what does he build? Well, he builds a statue like the one in his dream. Except, what is the key difference between the two? The statue that he has built in Daniel 3 is fully gold. All of it is gold, not just the head, not just a part, all of it. Nebuchadnezzar here is making a statement and trying to rewrite the future. It's him saying, no empire, no kingdom will come after mine. There is just my empire. See, although I've had this prophetic dream, I will reshape the future, and it is all me, all my empire, all gold. And I'll have everyone who works for me, all my representatives throughout my empire, come bow down to it, so they can see who is truly the permanent Lord of the earth, if there was any question about that. And so, as we can see, looking at the context of chapter 2 dramatically changes our understanding of chapter 3, why Nebuchadnezzar built that golden statue, what he's reacting to, and what the statue represents, his imperial permanence. Now, another thing we hopefully noticed while exegeting was the presence of repetition in this chapter. Repetition is a huge stylistic tool applied in this passage. Let's have a look at an example. Verse 2. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Okay, and then verse 3. So the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. You might have thought, well, yes, I heard you the first time in verse 2. No reason to repeat it all again in the very next verse. Now we have more repetition in verses 5 and 7. That when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Verse 7. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Verse 10 and 15. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue. Now, verse 15. Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you shall fall down and worship the statue that I have made. Okay, so we noted in our preliminary observations that there is a lot of repetition here, even tedious repetition. Why? In fact, this style differs from the rest of the book. The rest of Daniel doesn't have this very deliberate, repeated citing of the same list style. So why is it here? Well, quite simply put, what does repetition of exactly the same thing do to us psychologically? If we know exactly what's going to happen, what takes place in our mind? A feeling of predictability, a feeling of knowing what's coming next, with no surprises and an identical repetition of something. We are left with a feeling of uniformity, sameness. And when considering this theme in the greater story of this chapter, that seems quite appropriate. The author is trying to highlight to us, the reader, how repetition is used to create a feeling of control. Nebuchadnezzar is trying to control his own destiny, the outcome of history, where the story is leading. He's not only doing this by making this fully golden statue, but the entire worship service set around bowing to this statue is also very controlled. It follows a precise list, that is not to be diverted from. Nebuchadnezzar gives the reader the feeling that he is in control through repetition. As we said, repetition emphasizes the expectation of conformity. Have you ever been a part of a choir, even as a child, and you make a mistake? You come in too soon or you stop singing too late, and it feels embarrassing to be that one voice out of place. Well, in this scene, rebellion is made harder to carry out because of the emphasis on conformity. The more rigid and perfect the straight line, the more unthinkable disobedience becomes. Therefore, Daniel's three friends creates tension and drama in this chapter. Now, if we apply the greater textual context to Daniel 3, we might know that specificity around worship was not new or foreign to these Judean young men. Their faith and worship of their God has a history of specific processes attached to it. In Exodus 25, God gives specific instructions about how the tent where he is to live among his people is to be designed and made, and the making of his throne called the ark. They shall make an ark of acacia wood. It shall be 2.5 cubits long, a cubit and a half wide, and a cubit and a half high. And these very specific instructions were indeed followed. Chapter 37, Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood. It was 2.5 cubits long, a cubit and a half wide, and a cubit and a half high. The point being that considering the greater context of the faith and culture of these Judean men, specificity around worship was not a foreign concept. Now, Daniel 3 verse 1 says, King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. 1 cubit was a measurement equal to about 18 inches or 45 centimeters. So we're told the statue was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, or 27 meters tall and 2.7 meters wide. The first thing that should strike us here is how disproportionate this image is. It is terribly tall, 10 times higher than wide. A very thin statue, not really appearing like a proportionate human being at all. Its height sort of emphasizes how towering, lofty, and above everything it is. And another detail that should stand out to us is the repetition of sixes in this statue. 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide. The Babylonian math system was not our decimal numeral system, which is built around tens. The Babylonians had a mathematical system called sexagetical, so built around a six-centric system. Suffice to say, the author is trying to show us that this statue is built very much from and out of a Babylonian mindset. It is, even down to the very numbers, Babylonian. Now again we come back to comparing chapter 2 with chapter 3. In chapter 2, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue, it ends with it being hit by a hurtling stone. The stone takes the feet out from under this statue of empires and brings destruction to it. The point here is that something will bring an end to the long march of earthly empires. The oppression of empire won't last forever. There will be an interruption to human power, pride, and ambition. Now, let's contrast that with chapter 3. Everything is going wonderfully until Daniel's friends do not bow down to the statue along with everyone else. They are the interruption, the thing which threatens to bring this perfect control and uniformity coming crashing down. Similar to the stone in chapter 2, they rebel now with an intentional defiance. And do you remember how we looked at repetition? The repetition of those there, the repetition of the instruments played, and when these are heard, everyone there is expected to bow down to the statue. Well, when Daniel's friends don't bow, some Babylonians rat on them to the king. At this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and that you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you shall fall down and worship the statue that I have made. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Notice when the Chaldeans come to the king and accuse Daniel's friends, they say the same. They use the same pattern. The sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, the same exact repetition. Then when the king talks to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he uses the exact same repetition. Everyone else is still conforming, still insisting on the control. But how now do the three friends reply to the king? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Did you notice? They don't repeat the list. They don't repeat the pattern. The way they speak to the king only further highlights how much they're not in line. They even speak differently from the others. And the author is using this to highlight the message: you, Nebuchadnezzar, you do not control us. Something about us breaks your repetitive, controllable pattern. Another thing you may have noticed in verse 17, if God is able to deliver us from the furnace, let him deliver us. That's not a very confident sounding statement, is it? If God is able, there's often some confusion as to this translation. It can either be translated as if he is able, or if he wants to, he is able. And we as readers are given space to decide what is meant. In deciding, we must lay aside our prejudices and what we want it to mean, and instead go back to looking at the context of the rest of the chapter. What makes sense within the context? Well, if Daniel's friends really believed that God was not able to save them, they might as well find another God. But they clearly think their God is special somehow, otherwise they wouldn't be risking their lives to stay loyal to him. They must somehow believe that he is something other than the gods that surround them in the land of Babylon. And so, it's safe to conclude that the best interpretation here would be the second option. If he wants to, he is able to. Not because this interpretation ties things up in a pretty satisfying bow for us, but because the text leads us there. It suits the context. You may have noticed some other thematic pointers in this chapter. The theme of being bound, the helplessness this represents, bound victims, and the following last-minute rescuing conclusion, where Daniel's friends are not saved from the flames, but through them. This defying of death. And the other theme of fire. Just because fire is mentioned in Daniel 3, it doesn't mean it's automatically connected with every other story containing fire in the Bible. Let's just be clear on that. That is eisegeting. But so far there has been a theme of narratives about fire being connected with judgment, such as in the case of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. This application is relevant in this story because Nebuchadnezzar, considered in his time to be king and God, uses fire as a judgment on those who dare disobey him. But the irony is, Nebuchadnezzar wants to destroy Daniel's friends with the thing their God had symbolically used in the Bible. It is being purposed for proving their God's weakness and impotence. He even states this himself in verse 15b, "But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Nebuchadnezzar is saying, you say your God can save you? Well, I'll heat this furnace to 7 times the customary heat. Let's see how your God helps you escape that. Verse 22. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. First, the 3 friends are messing up Nebuchadnezzar's narrative of how his power is untouchable. Now, their execution is interrupted, and God himself shows up. Nebuchadnezzar wanted the fire to prove their God's weakness, but God repurposes the fire to be a vehicle of their experience with God, reiterating the truth of the vision in Daniel 2, that no earthly power, no empire will last. The stone will bring them all come crashing down, even when at the height of those powers they seem untouchable. And this story concludes with Nebuchadnezzar saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his messenger and delivered his servants who trusted in him." And as we said, if we look past the artificial division of this chapter, this story actually finishes in Daniel 4, with Nebuchadnezzar making his public declaration throughout his empire. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that live throughout the earth, may you have abundant prosperity. The signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me, I am pleased to recount. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his sovereignty is from generation to generation. Nebuchadnezzar goes through a journey in this text. From Daniel 2, I will not accept this vision that there is any mightier than I'm in control, my kingdom is everlasting, to here is the Most High God. Look at him. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. So there we have it, our first exegesis homework. There's no doubt much more that can be gleaned from this text. There always is, and you no doubt have other observations and notes, which is good. It's not about spotting everything in one go, and you will never see everything in the text. It's about understanding the original meaning of the text better than we did before. I hope you found this activity useful, applying some of the tools we've learned so far, and that it's given you a taste to do some exegeting yourself. You can set yourself homework at any time, pick a verse, a paragraph, and do the same thing. There are more text studies we're going to be looking at together coming up in this course, so more of this type of thing on the horizon. Now we leave behind Daniel 3 and stride into our topic for today's class, namely narrative. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the significance of Hebrew narrative reading, reminding ourselves, why does the Bible use narrative in the first place? We'll add to our list of Hebrew narrative devices and how they are born out of the Old Testament world. And lastly, we'll touch on the history of how Adventism and many other denominations have approached biblical narrative in the past, and how they're approaching it in the present. So, first of all, what do we mean when we say narrative? Well, quite simply, we mean story, stories. And at least one third of the Old Testament is narratives, and perhaps a half of the New Testament. So, a lot of stories. In short, you can't hide from stories when reading the Bible. Now, you wouldn't think that was something that someone would want to do. But as we'll discover, there's a lot of hiding from narrative among modern Bible readers. And perhaps the point is, we shouldn't be. We've touched on this earlier. There's an impatience embedded in Western readers around biblical story. If God is the God of the universe, and we have a short time here on earth, and he's trying to convince us of something, doesn't he have something better to do than tell stories? Wouldn't there be a more direct, efficient way to say something, to make an argument? Why is God wasting time with stories? And therein lies what is often our problem. We think of story as ways to fill in time. When you're at the dentist, trying to keep your mind off the drill, so to speak, a form of mere entertainment or fluff, even associated with less factual or manipulation. In many of our cultures, stories have often been devalued, especially in spaces that touch on philosophical thought and theology. This ties into what we spoke about in our last class about the Greek versus Hebrew mindset, how a Western mind, product of Hellenistic philosophy, will answer the question, what is the point of life? Why am I here? Versus how the Hebrew person at the bus stop will answer you. The Hebrew worldview knew the irresistible power of stories. And I dare say, before we all grew up, so did we. We once knew something called wonder and imagination. And some of us came to automatically view these things as opposite to critical thinking and facts, which of course is not the case at all. Wonder and imagination. We have it when we're children. We knew the value of stories. Why do we lose it? Or why do we leave it behind when approaching the Bible? Because if at least one third of it is story, we clearly need to have that wonder and imagination there too. The Bible is not just a list of doctrine, because a list of doctrine doesn't accurately portray what it's like to have a relationship with this God. In fact, a list of facts or doctrine doesn't really capture what a real relationship is like with anyone, does it? Story, by its very nature, better reflects life, what it's like to live, and better reflects the nature of interpersonal relationships. There is so much narrative in this book because the author wants the readers to experience God, not simply know about him, but to experience him. To do this, we must embrace imagination and wonder. What is the meaning of life? Let me tell you a story. Now, theologians can have a professional gift of making simple things complicated and to turn things into theoretical and abstract concepts. As a theologian myself, I can attest to this. I'd like to demonstrate how this can play out in a real context. I myself grew up in a religious denomination called the Seventh-day Adventist Church, SDA, or Adventist for short. And Adventists have a collection of doctrines or statements of belief called the 28 Fundamental Beliefs. You can look them up online, they are there for all to see. These 28 fundamental beliefs are used as tests of faith. When a person wishes to be baptized, they will often be asked, sometimes publicly in front of their church, whether or not they believe in each of these fundamental beliefs. Let's take the example of fundamental belief number 10. Number 10 is called the experience of salvation. And this is how it reads. In infinite love and mercy, God made Christ, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might be made the righteousness of God. Led by the Holy Spirit, we sense our need, acknowledge our sinfulness, repent of our transgressions, and exercise faith in Jesus as Savior and Lord, substitute and example. This saving faith comes through the divine power of the Word and is the gift of God's grace. Through Christ we are justified, adopted as God's sons and daughters, and delivered from the lordship of sin. Through the Spirit we are born again and sanctified. The Spirit renews our minds, writes God's law of love in our hearts, and we are given the power to live a holy life. Abiding in Him, we become partakers of the divine nature and have the assurance of salvation now and in the judgment. Followed by a long list of Bible verses. The experience of salvation. I'd like you to imagine for a moment being back at that bus stop, and someone stands next to you and asks you, "What is the Christian faith?" And you reply this: "In infinite love and mercy, God made Christ, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might be made the righteousness of God. Led by the Holy Spirit, we sense our need, acknowledge our sinfulness, repent of our transgressions." My goodness. Is this statement true? Yes, according to the Bible, it is true. But in order to understand this statement, all you need to know is who the Holy Spirit is, what sinfulness is, what transgression means, what is faith, who is Jesus, what does Christ mean, what does substitute mean, and adoption and lordship, justification, sanctification, law, divine nature, judgment, and how on earth God writes on our hearts. But once you've understood all those things, it's pretty simple. This statement of fundamental belief number 10, about the experience of salvation no less, is a statement written for the eye. It is something to be read, dryly, theoretically, disconnectedly. Now let us compare this way of doing theology with how Jesus spoke about the experience of salvation. And Jesus said, "There was a certain man who had 2 sons." And many of you know the rest of that story, the story of the prodigal son. That story doesn't only get to our theoretical mind, it gets to the heart, the mind, the body. It hits us not just as a theory. The story invites us into experience a living, real, impactful, holistic way of experiencing salvation that connects with real life, more than any committee of theologians could produce or sum up. And let us now consider who the audience is. Well, living, breathing, complex, holistic human beings. Not chopped into pieces, our head disconnected from our body. Story approaches the whole person, and so does the salvation of God. Talking about the experience of being saved is best represented in a story. Not because it's more entertaining that way, not merely as a trick to retain the listener's attention, and certainly not with the goal of eluding preciseness. Actually, quite the contrary. Talking about the experience of being saved is best presented in a story because it is a truer vehicle, more truly expressing the experience, a vehicle that doesn't at its core so distort the reality. And that is a huge reason why the Bible is full of stories. And that's also why most of us would be able to complete the rest of the story of the prodigal son and not be able to remember fundamental belief number 10. So to sum up, the Bible is full of narrative. It is often not read as narrative, which is a pity because we miss out on the point and experience of it. And this is something we need to recapture. Now let's go on to look at some more aspects particular to Hebrew narrative. We made a good start of learning some of these stylistic devices yesterday. We also learned a bit about the Old Testament world and how it affects this literature. Here are a few other things to be aware of, beginning with exaggeration. There is a great deal of exaggeration in the Old Testament. Some of you may know I have lived in England for quite a number of years, and in British culture, people value understatement. Derek, my husband, has joked that I actually exhibit a lot of this aspect of British culture. Sometimes, if I think something is great, I'll say, not bad. Or instead of saying, you're right, I'll say, you're not wrong. Now, to an average American, saying not bad about something can almost seem like an aggression. But to a British person's ear, this is high praise indeed. That double negative, not bad, in a culture which prizes understatement, is highly positive. Not bad is the equivalent of awesome to an American. If you get not bad from a professor at university, you go home and throw a party because that truly means something superlative and amazing. Now, I compared this Britishism to the American counterpart, but if you think Americans are excitable or too over the top, here comes Hebrew culture. Because when it comes to the Hebrews and even neighboring Near Eastern peoples, we find a culture that delights in exaggeration. Deliberate exaggeration was used for impact. In English, we call this hyperbole. Let me illustrate this point. In ancient times, if a young Hebrew woman was to say to her beloved, "Do you love me? Do you really care for me?" her Hebrew boyfriend or husband would say this, "Oh, how beautiful you are, my love, so very beautiful. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats moving from the slopes of Gilead." Now, if that same young lady had had an English boyfriend, he would have more likely replied, "You're not bad, I suppose." And that would be culturally considered praise or warmth by many British people. Understatement and overstatement. Now, the rhetoric of love in Hebrew uses overstatement. But if we know this is how it works, if we understand this aspect of the culture, then we can mentally take a 20, 30, 40% discount of what is being said, because we know it's exaggeration. But what happens, for example, when this same culture shows up in the rhetoric not of romance, but of judgment? This is one of those areas where modern Western readers get into trouble. Let's look at one of those passages, Psalm 21, verses 8 to 12. Your hand will lay hold on all your enemies, your right hand will seize your foes. When you appear for battle, you will burn them up as in a blazing furnace. The Lord will swallow them up in his wrath, and his fire will consume them. You will destroy their descendants from the earth, their posterity from mankind. Though they plot evil against you and devise wicked schemes, they cannot succeed. You will make them turn their backs when you aim at them with drawn bow. And when we read this, we might say, "Oof, all right, steady on. That's a bit rough, isn't it?" But you see, that's how a British person might feel about the Hebrew guy talking about his wife. All right, tone it down, steady on, no need to be so flowery and dramatic. Now, here's something interesting. We have an easier time making the mental adjustment when seeing the Hebrew poetry, the romantic expression. We find it easier to say, yes, when these people talk about love, they go overboard. We must allow for the fiery language. But we also have to deliberately apply this again and say, when they talk about judgment, they also go overboard. There is an exaggeration in the language used for judgment as well. And if we give 40% discount on the rhetoric of love, we need to give that same discount to the rhetoric of judgment, of anger and threat and violence. To us, many of these biblical passages seem very harsh, but it is literally exaggeration and hyperbole. The point is not to be inaccurate, it is a reflection of the culture. This also doesn't mean it is a reflection of God. If it reflects anything about God, it shows that He is willing to speak into a certain culture, to relate to how they communicate, and He adapts accordingly so they understand. So, when you're reading that in the Old Testament, take that into account. Things are likely going to be said in a more over the top, extreme manner than some of us might be used to. Apply the discount when reading it. Let's now have a look at the whole idea of divine responsibility. This idea permeates the Bible. In the modern West, we think of things in terms of degrees of responsibility. More responsible or less responsible. In British law, there is allowance for diminished responsibility. The outcome may be a person dead, but the law creates degrees of responsibility. For example, murder versus manslaughter, first-degree murder versus second-degree murder. And in the Bible, we often come at stories with the question, is God responsible for that, or is he not? Now, this is where we have to try to enter a different world. Because unlike us, the Hebrews thought of God's involvement in the world along these lines. Is there only one God? Yes. Since there is only one God, and He is Lord of all, then ultimate responsibility rests with God. The buck stops with Him. Because if there is only one God, then in one sense, the final responsibility rests with Him. This helps to explain some seemingly odd passages we come across in the Bible. Let's look at one of these, 2 Samuel 24:1. Again the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go and take a census of Israel and Judah. This is an account of David taking a census of the Israelites. We're told in a single sentence that the anger of the Lord is kindled, and he incites David against them. So who incited David to take the census? Well, according to this text, it was the Lord. Now, in 1 Chronicles 21, the same incident is referred to. It's the same event told from a different perspective. And in 1 Chronicles, it says, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. Now, you don't need an advanced degree in theology to notice the difference here between saying God did something and Satan did something. But to the Hebrew mind, there is only one God, He is Lord of all, thus ultimately God is responsible. What Chronicles does is point out what it says in 2 Samuel, that's not the whole story. Because as much as God is ultimately responsible, those he is responsible for are up to things, and they make choices, and they act as well of their own free will. So while we may come at this story about David and say, this discrepancy is a big problem, which one's right? A Hebrew mind says, well, it's like this, and it's also like that. God is ultimately responsible, and his creation have free will, and they do things too. Another classic example of this divine responsibility coming into play can be found in the story of the 10 plagues, where we look at 3 verses from the book of Exodus. Exodus 9:34. But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned once more and hardened his heart, he and his officials. So that's clear. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. The next verse, verse 35, gives us a different statement, a neutral statement. So the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. So his heart was hardened. a sort of neutral statement. A thing happens. And the next verse, chapter 10, verse 1, then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his officials, in order that I may show these signs of mine among them." God says, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart." So which is it? Is it Pharaoh? Is it God? Or is it a neutral thing? Who is to blame? Who is responsible? Again, we think as modern readers this is a big problem, a great discrepancy. But to the Hebrew mind, this is less of a problem, because there's only one God, and we turn to Him as the ultimate responsible one, even when He isn't directly doing something. Because we view Him as God alone, we aim our complaints, our requests at Him. Now we try to nuance this more, but the Hebrew mindset places God more in the center of the involvement in the affairs of the world than is normally the case in most Christian minds today. A third element to keep in mind is that the Old Testament works with a corporate worldview. And here we have a fundamentally different idea than we have in our modern Western mindset. Our modern world is individualistic, whereas the Hebrew world was corporate. A focus was placed on the group, togetherness, the moving together, the community, the whole. Not that the individual didn't matter, but the community was often what is addressed. There is not this severing of the one person from the whole. For example, when we think of sin, we think mainly of it in an individualistic manner. I am a sinner. I have sinned. I need to get forgiveness from God for my sin. But in ancient Israel, the basic building block of society was the community, and in time periods, the extended family. Now, I had the unusual pleasure of being able to meet my great-grandmother. This was made possible because both my great-grandmother and my grandmother had children when they were 16 or so very young. In ancient Israel, there would usually be up to 4 generations alive at once in a family, and in those days, these 4 generations would be living together simultaneously. This was the building block of society, and so the narrative will be affected by this family unit reality which they had. And as we said, there is a focus on corporate sin as well. The harmful things I do, the way we sin, is not my private affair. It affects everybody. Everybody in my extended family, all of those 3, 4 generations, and my greater community. And so the way sin is talked about is often from the perspective of the impact it has on society, on family, and a challenge to that selfishness. So that's why thinking corporately enables us to think of what impact our sin has not just on me, but on others. This is, for example, why there are texts where God talks about the consequences of sin being visited on third and fourth generations. This is not about corporate punishment. It has nothing to do with inflicting some curse on children because of what their parents did. He is talking about how the choices we make will affect those under our roof, those in your vicinity, in this close community living under one roof. And that is your responsibility, to challenge what you're passing down to these younger generations. It's not about saddling children with their parents' mistakes, but saying your sin is not a private affair. It will affect those alive at the same time as you. And for anyone who has family trauma, they can attest to the deep-rooted truth of this. Now, for our next point, we expand a bit on something we've already touched on, Greek thinking versus Hebrew thinking, West versus Near East, if you will. We've said that Hebrew narrative existed and grew out of the context of Hebrew thought and Hebrew worldview. So the Old Testament is not just written in a different language, and it's not growing out of Western thought or Hellenistic Greek thought. We've said how Greek thinking permeates everything in the West: our education system, our legal system, the way we reason and hear stories and solve problems. It lays as a foundation underneath it all. It affects how we view the world. And so we sometimes struggle to understand what is happening in the Old Testament. Let's look at an example of the difference between how Hebrews thought and Greeks thought. Athens versus Jerusalem, so to speak. Greek thought tends to be focused on the universal, timeless, concerns abstractions, and is impersonal and analytical. Now, this language is very helpful when you're doing philosophy or science. Greek thought is marvelous at this. But Hebrew thought differs. Instead of universal, it is particular. Instead of timeless, it is focused, it is time bound. It isn't concerned with abstract, but expresses itself in concrete terms. It is not impersonal, but personal, and it is holistic. Now, in our English language today, the Greek provided almost all of our abstract terms. The root words are often from Greek, but from Hebrew, none of them. If you look at a Hebrew lexicon, you will find very few abstract terms. When you consider the creation narrative the Bible gives us, for example, the story is concrete and specific. You can search from Genesis to the end of the Old Testament, and you won't discover theoretical discussions of the basic elements of the universe. The Greeks would have that discussion. The Greek mind will give you that, but the Hebrew won't. But they'll give you stories of creation. The Old Testament also gives us stories concerning kings and queens, the rulers of the land, but there's no theoretical discussion about monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy even. Now, of course, with the Greeks, there are discussions about all those theories. All the Hebrews give us are stories. You see what that king did? You see what this queen does? What do you think of that? What questions does that stir in you? So the Hebrew world is concrete, specific, time-bound, and particular. It's not going to go to the places where Greek thought goes. And we might say, oh, that's a pity. But of course, the other side of that coin is that Greek thought rarely goes to the places Hebrew thought goes to. Let's return to language. We already know that the Bible wasn't originally written in English. But something to note is that when we use a different language, we also use a different mental process. Your brain works differently. People who are bilingual might be able to relate to this. Some even describe it as having different personalities based on what language they're speaking. When they switch over to another language, their body language changes too, and how they process information, how they go about problem solving, their state of mind and temperament. There are, for example, countless humorous quips about this particular Italian hand gesture. Often, when non Italian speakers want to imitate speaking Italian, they will do this with their hands. And the joke is that even on the football pitch, Italian players unfailingly express themselves using it. The mental processes you have to go through to read the Hebrew text requires different skills than reading Greek. A simple example of this is the fact that you read in the opposite direction. Hebrew is written from right to left, like in the case of Arabic. Language can affect our thinking in dramatic ways. For example, how we think about time. In the English language, we make an implicit assumption that time moves in a line, and it moves from left to right, the direction we happen to read in. We talk about pushing meetings forwards and backwards, and if you ask an English speaker to draw a timeline, they will likely make the past being left and the future being right. But that's not true of all languages. Ask a Hebrew-speaking person the same question, and they are more likely to draw the timeline from right to left, because that's how their writing system works. And since Chinese is traditionally written from top to bottom, Mandarin speakers are more likely to think about time as being vertical and flowing downwards. They'll use the word down when talking about future events. So next week would actually be down week. Speakers of yet other languages don't even see time as being in a line, but flowing in a circle. We might say in English, this has been a long week or a short week, because we fundamentally think of time in terms of length. But that was far less true in Greek, where they talk about time as having volume. So a long day would be a full day, while a short day would be a small day. This is interesting when you consider phrases such as the fullness of time. When the time has come for something to happen, it being called the fullness of time. Mandarin doesn't have a future tense. Instead of saying it will rain, you say it rains tomorrow. Our languages affect our attitude towards something as fundamental as time. And studies show that these differences in language affects the way which we process information and concepts. That is relevant to reading the Bible. To be aware that, again, it's not merely an issue of translation of words, but there's a difference in brain processes. So if we look at the language tree of the West, we see the origin languages and how they spread out and develop into others. Greek is obviously not in the Germanic branch of languages, and so will have a different grammar system. Now, Greek has a complex grammar, and that grammar dictates how you're going to read a particular sentence. When you look at a Greek word, say it's a noun, it will be in what we call a certain case. And you'll know which case a noun is in because of the word's ending it tells you. If you come to another word, a verb this time, it will tell you if it's past, present, future, perfect, by its ending, just like in English. And so, if you know Greek grammar, you know precisely what you're reading when you read through that string of words. The author has provided you with what you need to understand what he's writing. And being aware of Greek grammar can be immensely helpful and insightful when exegeting. Let's look at a quick example. Matthew 11:28. Jesus is speaking to the crowds, and he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Most English translations don't diverge much from this translation, but let's have a quick look at the grammar. Come to me, all those toiling and being burdened, and I will anapauzo you. When we look at the grammar, we discover anapauzo is not a noun, it is a verb. From the root word anapauzo, meaning completing a process which intensifies to give an experience. And so a better translation would be, come to me, all those toiling and being burdened, and I will rest you, instead of I will give you rest. When we think of rest as a noun, and Jesus is giving it to people, we think of it as him handing over an object. Rest becomes an object. The rest becomes this thing that he hands over to someone who is weary. But when we shift gears into knowing this is a verb, well, that becomes rather interesting. Suddenly, the language shifts from Jesus handing over an object to rest being relational. It's not merely give you rest, it's I will rest you. It becomes inherently attached to Jesus. It's something he's actively, a verb, doing. Resting from your tiredness and burdens, therefore, seems to be interwoven with Jesus and his activity. His verbing, his doing. It's something he's actively making for you. Additionally, we see here anapauzo comes from the root word anapao, meaning completing a process which intensifies to give an experience. So as weary people come to Jesus, He rests them, gives them an experience which intensifies. Him resting you begins when you have a relationship with Him, and it keeps growing until it will finally be completed or wholly achieved. This is a rest that is beginning now, with the promise of it growing until one day that experience is fully integrated in your life experience. So that is just a small example of how Greek grammar guides us to understanding the text better. Now, in contrast, the Hebrew grammar is very different. Hebrew has a much simpler grammar, which may initially sound fun for those who don't like learning grammar, but when interpreting can pose quite a challenge. Hebrew only has two tenses, and they're not even tenses as we think of tenses in English. In fact, let's have a short exercise to look at here. We recall the original Hebrew Bible was written without any vowels, so what we have in the original text is only consonants. And we learned that there weren't spaces between the words either, just a block of consonants. And now we know there are only two tenses, so we might see something like this. This is obviously anglicized. How do we figure out what the first word is? Is it hot, hit, heat, heel, hat? Only through context will we find the right answer. Now, if you know the story is about a boy hitting a nail with a hammer, then this helps us unlock the text. Context is key to navigate the challenge of Hebrew grammar. Yes, we're talking about context again. Surprise, surprise. Even on a grammatical level, reading the text based on what came before and what came after is going to be everything. Your most important tool. You know whether to pick hot or heat or hit by asking, what's this whole thing about? What's the story about? What's the chapter about? And so, as you can tell, reading Hebrew is far more complex than reading Greek. So for the Hebrews, meaning is determined by context. This is true of the ancient literature. This is a reflection of Hebrew mindset. Jonathan Sacks writes in his book, The Great Partnership, that reading Greek versus reading Hebrew uses different parts of the brain. Even on a physiological level, reading Greek isn't like reading Hebrew. And if we read Hebrew texts like the Greek ones, we're going to make big mistakes. The left hemisphere of the brain tends to predominantly deal with the pre-analytical, logical, mechanical. It breaks things down into their component parts and deals with them in a linear, sequential way. This is Greek, where the Greek is processed. The right brain, which we quite rightly might associate more with Hebrew, tends to be integrated and holistic. It gives an overview of a situation, while the left hemisphere focuses its attention on specific details. Now, this information all comes with a warning. It is important to stress here. It is possible for us to make the mistake of taking these differences, these principles, and overemphasizing them. So be aware of that. Let's not overemphasize these insights. But having this awareness is useful too. There was no Aristotle in Jerusalem, and there was no Isaiah in Athens. And if we are in Jerusalem expecting to read Aristotle and we hear Isaiah, we've made a big mistake and won't understand a thing, and vice versa. In each case, we must concisely note what world we're in, and we have to operate in a different way to understand them. In Hebrew, holistic, imaginative, wonder, all expressed through narrative and poetry rather than scientific data. This is not to say that Greek isn't helpful, but it's just not helpful for reading the Old Testament. We've already looked at how the Greek mindset is this versus that, while the Hebrew is more this and that. Well, another related difference is that the Greek mindset sees this thing and this thing and this thing in the world around them, and then says, let's draw all this together into a single synthesis, into a single theory which explains these various phenomena, gathering all into one place. The Hebrew mindset reverses that. They say, let's look at this single thing and examine it. And then let's look at the second single thing and ponder on that. And then go over to the third. This helps to explain some of these strange things we might read in the Old Testament. An example, Proverbs 26:4. Do not answer fools according to their folly, lest you be a fool yourself. And the very next verse, answer fools according to their folly, lest they be wise in their own eyes. First line, don't answer fools. Second line, answer fools. Well, which is it? Do you answer or do you not? The Hebrew author says, sometimes it's like this and sometimes it's like that. The world is complex. The world is full of all kinds of fools. The advice given by Solomon encompasses more than one course of action. And how are you to know whether to apply the first advice or the second advice? Well, you need wisdom. Wisdom to know when it's right to do this thing and when it's right to do that thing. Because life can't be reduced to a single theory. And Hebrew literature beautifully reflects that. Where Greek minds may see damning contradiction, there is actually wisdom and a fair reflection of reality. Another example, Genesis 1:1-3. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. In this verse, we gain a picture of a God who is above. He is transcendent. He speaks and it happens. The next story in Genesis 2, then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. When was the last time you were aware of another person's breath in your nostrils? I imagine it may have been while you were kissing them. There is a big shift here. The high above God. Now, hands in the dirt, breathing into someone's nostrils, so close, face to face. We go from the transcendent high God who speaks and it happens, creates life itself, stars, planets, space and time, to the personal God who kneels down, who digs his hands into the dirt, who gives the kiss of life to his creation. So close, face to face. And this face is the first thing in his entire life that Adam sees. The Hebrew mind grasps it's like this and it's also like that. The Greeks would bring it all together in a grand theory, but the Hebrews say, no, not too theoretical. Let's keep the heart beating in the story. Let the blood flow through it with human interest. Having this awareness can bring comfort to some Bible studiers, because when you read the Bible, you don't have to be upset if you come across one thing and then read something else and think, well, which is it? Is the Bible full of contradictions? No. Instead, you've just experienced Hebrew thinking. And the Hebrew thinker says, in life, as in scriptures, sometimes it's like this, and sometimes it's like that. And if you keep reading, this story will offer you the wisdom to tell the difference. So to summarize, when reading the Hebrew Old Testament, it helps to know about divine responsibility, the corporate worldview, and how Hebrew thought differs from Greek and Western culture. The Old Testament will become a bit less mystifying and distant, and a bit easier for us to grasp and engage with when remembering these things. We looked at SDA fundamental belief number 10 earlier. To round off our class for today, we will conduct a brief survey of Adventist attitudes towards literary interpretation of the Bible and narrative reading. I realize that this particular denomination's history may not be relevant or even relatable to everyone taking this class, and that shouldn't be a problem, as many of these attitudes are found in broader contexts than merely within Adventism. So apply as you see fit. When we say a literary reading, this simply means a narrative reading. reading narratives in the Bible like they are narratives. Despite the Bible being full of narratives, as we've said, people rarely read them as such, which is a real pity. We talked about how hermeneutics is the discipline and study of method. How do we study the Bible? What methodologies do we apply? Hermeneutics in Adventism was not investigated with any real determination until about 45 years ago. Let's go back to the year 1974. This was a significant year because that year there was a North American Bible Conference. The topic of that year was, how should we study the Bible? There were two contributions to that discussion by a very well-known Old Testament scholar. His name is Gerhard Hazel. The first paper he presented contained general principles of biblical interpretation. In this, he made no mention of literary interpretation at all. And then in his second paper, he showed how biblical interpretation should be done. In it, he looked at Isaiah chapter 5 as an example. At no point did he mention literary interpretation or bring up narrative. He points out a chiasm in one verse, and then that's it. He concludes that Isaiah 5 belongs to the masterpieces of world literature. I don't disagree with him, but he provided nothing on which to base this conclusion. And this style of approaching the Bible has remained typical of the Adventist approach to the Bible ever since. And not just in the Adventist organization either, the Adventist understanding is typical of most Christian understanding. To put it plainly, there is a history of great passion, even obsession, about this book in Adventism, but very poor methodology or understanding of it as a narrative and as literature. And where there's lack of awareness about method, as we're continuing to see, big, messy, continuous mistakes will be made. In place of sound method that anyone can learn and use, biblical interpretation will come to depend more and more on the authoritarian opinions of clergy and mindless tradition and habit, instead of reasoned, informed, responsible study that anyone should be able to have access to. So, let's take a closer look at Adventism's hermeneutical approach to the Bible. The traditionally applied approach is called the historical grammatical approach. The historical grammatical approach stipulates that you need three things in order to understand the text. 1, you need an understanding of history. 2, an understanding of languages. And 3, an understanding of theology. The reasoning here is you need to know about history, you need a grasp of grammar, referring to the knowledge of language, and some theology, the right theology, to come to the right conclusions. Now, hopefully by now, we've made clear enough in this class that these things in themselves are not wrong. We are not opposed to knowledge about history, grammar, and theology. They come into exegesis. But what we have often ended up with can be likened to when you order a salad in a certain restaurant and they bring you a sad-looking bowl containing only torn-up lettuce. You look at the bowl and think, is this it? I ordered a meal and you've brought me some leaves. The point is, these things are not wrong, but there needs to be something else as well. Historically, there have been loud objections within Adventism about treating the Bible like a piece of narrative, like a piece of literature. Meaning also there have been objections to the narrative approach and narrative interpretation of the Bible, to read it like a story, a true story, a story nonetheless. Scholar and lay people alike have said the Bible isn't just literature. And I think the word just is where the misunderstanding comes in. This objection comes from a place of people equating thinking of the Bible as literature with saying the Bible is just another book, like War and Peace and Pride and Prejudice and Shakespeare, that it isn't special or inspired or set apart. But these two truths aren't in automatic opposition to each other. The Bible can be a piece of literature and be Holy Scriptures, be God inspired and like no other piece of literature. It can be literature and be authoritative at the same time, authoritative literature. But what has typically been lost is the bit about it being literature. In every class I've taught, when I've talked about the importance of reading the Bible as narrative, I've had people push back and say, no, no, that's wrong. And they ask me to make my case for why I'm promoting this approach. But really, when you think about it, it shouldn't be someone having to make a case for the literary approach. It should be them who make their case, who have to defend their choice for not treating it as literature. We needn't be afraid to call the Bible literature and approach it as such, to think that by doing so we're downgrading the Bible. The Bible is more than literature, but it is not less than literature. Another way of making this point: the Bible is more than history, and yet we're fine with analyzing it historically. Why can we not learn about how Hebrew poetry works and still be reverent to the text? Why can you and I not believe that God inspired these writings and still analyze the literature it's presented as? Most Adventist works, since the time of Hazel's presentations, quite simply repeat the basic points that he made. Recently, there has been a little change which has arisen, a rise in a literary approach to the text, even within tiny pockets of Adventism, which is hopeful. One of my professors, for example, from college, was asked to write a commentary for part of 2 Samuel for the New Adventist Bible Commentary book series, and he was asked to include a literary analysis. So there are tiny steps in the right direction, and hopefully we as individuals can make much larger and more impactful strides. And if we do, how might that impact things? If we understand the Bible operates as literature, a few practical consequences this may produce are: 1. It may encourage creativity in preaching. The Bible, being full of narratives, has characters in them, they have plots, and these characters have real life problems in the plot. When one shares these stories, you are bringing to life real characters with real life problems. What a powerful opportunity to communicate effectively. Number 2, approaching the Bible as literature can make us more sensitive to aesthetics and the arts in general. It would remind us that God communicates to us through our senses as well as through our intellect. We live in a postmodern world, but even though the world has changed around us, Adventism has stayed stuck in communicating in one way, and that way is the way of modernism, which is concerned with abstract propositions expressed in philosophical terms. But that is not the way the Bible presents itself. It presents itself through narratives, poetry, parables, apocalyptic prophecies. Human beings are open to these kinds of expressions. Stories are always on the menu. It transcends trends and culture. Thirdly, a narrative approach highlights the spiritual value of the text. When we read a great narrative, it feeds our soul in a way that abstract theology does not. Abraham Heschel said that the language we usually use about God is taken from the classical world, Roman and Greek. What is God like, they ask? God is omnipotent. God is omnipresent. God is all-powerful. In other words, using abstract nouns to define God. But that is not the language the Bible uses. In the Bible, God loves, God saves, God heals, God acts, God defends, God hears. Active verbs. Can we see the dramatic difference in the two? Abstract nouns versus active verbs. What stirs your soul more? What draws you in and feels the most real? Treating the Bible like literature and a narrative doesn't demote it, it doesn't misrepresent it, it elevates it. It honors it for what it is and what it's trying to do. In their groundbreaking book, The Drama of Scripture, authors Bartholomew and Goheen talk about letting the Bible speak for itself. And the language it chooses to speak in is narrative. The language of the Bible is narrative, one overarching story, not a collection of creeds. If we ignore this, we will undoubtedly end up misunderstanding and misusing it. Some find it quite shocking and even disturbing when being told that the Bible is not a collection of abstract moral thoughts, nor is it a test of science, an encyclopedia, a rabbi's teaching, or an ethical debate, and it's not even doctrine. And if this sounds outlandish or wrong to you, I'd like to challenge you to consider how Jesus didn't give his disciples a set of doctrine. He lived with them. He didn't give them creeds. He let them experience what it's like to live with him, to experience God being there. He lived story with them. Why on earth would a group of people spend their lives, their time, leave behind what they used to be doing, some giving their very lives for a person, if the story they lived with that person didn't fundamentally reach in and touch their very essence? We looked at fundamental belief number 10 and how the vast, beautiful, real, dynamic, life-defining, dramatic, everyday journey of the experience of salvation was boiled down to cold, abstract concepts. Now, there is a time and place for that. If you need something to be concise and clear, there's nothing automatically wrong with using abstract language to boil down what you mean, but there is a world beyond its limitations. There is a feast beyond the torn up lettuce. There is a story beyond the doctrine. What would it look like if we tried for fun to rewrite the fundamental beliefs? Or rewrite one fundamental belief and rewrite it as a narrative instead, as a story using active verbs? What do you see God doing? What would it look like if you made a video of fundamental belief number 20? If you try to tell the story, if you played out the experience, what does it sound like? What does it look like? And with those looming questions hanging in the air, we come to a close for today's class. Your homework for tomorrow is going to be a musical one, and it connects to the creativity and imagination we've been talking about engaging with. You will be sent 6 different musical pieces to your email. Pick one and have a listen to it. Each song is a musical interpretation of a Bible scene or story. Now, this is, as always, in no way obligatory, but if you do want to take part, I'd like to encourage you to really listen to the pieces. Sit in a quiet room by yourself. Lie down on the floor if you want to. Close your eyes. Picture the scene in front of you as though you're watching a movie. Engage your imaginative approach to these biblical narratives. So pick one of these pieces, or of course you could listen to all of them if you want to, but pick at least one and see where it takes you, what creative juices get flowing. That's it. Tomorrow we will be looking shortly at genre and then character. Stories have characters, and the Old Testament sure has an interesting way of bringing those characters to us. For this, we will carry out several text studies together. Until then, see you next time.